What's that?
That's not $300.
Alright, we should be good.
But you got to 500. Let's not.
Alright, go from down.
Yeah.
Alright. Good evening, guys. How was everybody's day today? Yeah? Quick poll, who likes Tuesdays in general better? Anyone like their Tuesdays more? Everyone here likes Wednesdays more than Tuesdays? Yeah? Why?
More free.
My Monday, Wednesdays, I have 4 classes on, so I have to say I'm personally partial to Tuesdays, but Wednesdays are a fun day because I feel like you have one day until the weekend, and so. All right, so today we are going to be covering UI, UX design. Is there anybody that was not here yesterday? Okay, so if you were not here yesterday, is everybody in the Slack? Is there anyone not in the Slack in here? Okay, there's a link for that in a couple of slides. What we're going to do today is we're going to give an overview of UI UX design. Then we're going to do a very brief Figma walkthrough, so how to actually use and what the Figma interface looks like. Then we're going to talk about some fundamental design principles, so fonts, color, spacing, alignment, basically what makes a design look appealing, what makes an app look like it's something that you would want to use. And then we're going to end the day with a little interactive design challenge using everything we kind of covered today. So for those of you that weren't here yesterday, my name's Reed. I'm a junior in the college, double majoring CS and Econ, and I'm going to be teaching approximately the first 4 weeks of this.
My name's Colin. Hi, if you haven't met me. I'm teaching active and teachers mostly about React and that.
What's up, y'all? I'm Leo. I'm a freshman in the SFX, so I'll be teaching like the last 4 weeks of this course.
And then I don't think Amanda's here today. Yeah, Amanda's not here today, but she was here yesterday, and she'll be teaching, actually next class, a little deeper dive into some of Figma's more advanced features. So as I said, if you missed class yesterday, you can come talk to me, Colin, or Leo afterward, just to make sure. Yesterday was all about tooling and setup. So starting next class, when it comes to actually starting to code, that'll be important to make sure you have all the required tools. The one thing that I will say to everyone now is that there's, actually let me find, so this is the Slack channel, so everyone that's not in the Slack channel, scan this now. This is where we'll post important announcements. We'll post the lecture recordings that are also, if the previous slide, the YouTube channel is now up, and we posted the link to that in the Slack. The other thing is that in there, we need to make sure that everyone has access to the GitHub repo for all of the course notes. Colin or Leo, is that message pinned in the Slack? Can you pin it to make sure that everyone can see the repo of the notes? Basically, a quick recap, all of the lecture notes are going to be stored in a GitHub repo. And so all of the notes are on there from yesterday to make sure that you're set up with everything. The most important thing for today is going to be setting up Figma, which should be like a 2-minute process. So if you reference the notes from the GitHub yesterday, you should be able to create a Figma account and get that set up pretty straightforward. So the other thing we mentioned about if you have problems in the middle of class or if something comes up, I don't think this is going to be as pertainable to today, but once we get more hands-on with the coding, we said if always feel comfortable to raise your hand in the middle of class, and one of the instructors that are not actually giving the lecture will come by and help. If you'd rather first Slack message rather than raising your hand, feel free to Slack message Colin or Leo today, and they'll either respond right back to you or come over if it's something with your actual computer. This way, hopefully it doesn't feel as like obtrusive having to raise your hand in the middle of class. You can just Slack message one of them if you'd like, and they'll be happy to help troubleshoot during class. The other thing we're gonna do starting tonight is we're gonna create a dedicated questions channel. Again, this will be more relevant once we actually start writing code, but if you're working on something, you're working on your personal website and you have a question as to why something's not working outside of class, you can post a quick question in there and then we'll be monitoring that channel pretty tightly to make sure that everything's answered pretty quickly. So Slack, anything else that I missed? Questions, comments, or concerns before we start with UI UX design? All right, cool. Can somebody tell me what UI UX design means?
User interface, user experience design.
Okay, and what does user experience, user interface design mean?
The way that the customer interacts with the app.
That's definitely part of it. The way a customer interacts with an app, that's the user experience side of things. What does the user interface side of things mean? Anybody? What's your name?
Alex.
Alex?
It's like what the user sees.
Yeah, exactly. So UI stands for user interface, UX stands for user experience. These terms are very intertwined. UI design just describes how a website or app actually looks, and UX design is kind of how a user will interact with how it looks. And so when you put these two concepts together, UI UX design involves prototyping screens, so it's kind of like creating a blueprint for how a website or an app that you're going to build actually looks. And so why is good UI UX design important, right? I cannot understate enough how important a clean user interface is whenever you're building a website or an app, because people enjoy using software that is not only intuitive, but also visually appealing. And I feel like if you think about the apps that you enjoy using yourself, I would be willing to bet that a large portion of that is either it looks really clean or it's really easy to use. And if you're in the entrepreneurship space, poor UI UX design will cost you money because there's people that will not use your service or use your app because it doesn't feel nice to use. So I mean, it's very integral to the product you're building to make sure that it doesn't only look nice, but it's also easy to use. And the other side of that is that a clean UI conveys a sense of professionalism and trust with the user, right? So they want to feel like they're using a service that's very trustworthy, and if it looks janky and doesn't seem well formatted, then they may be less inclined to actually use whatever website or app you're trying to build. The other thing that I want to emphasize is that a good UI UX design is equally as important for you when it comes to the development stage as it is for the actual user. The reason I say this is that having a good UI UX design to reference from when you go to start building makes the development process so many times easier than if you just try and start coding from scratch. And the reason why is that when you go and sit down to actually code, if you have a blueprint that you can reference and say, this is exactly what I want to code, it's going to save so many hours when it comes to actually structuring components, styling these components. We'll get into all of that. But essentially, this does all the heavy lifting to where when you go and code, you're saving yourself a lot of time because you know exactly what you're going to be building. And the other side of this is, I feel like most of the people in this room are not here for the UI UX portion of the course. I'm well aware of that. But having a good UI UX background, if you want to go get a job as a developer, a front-end developer, even as a back-end developer, this is really something that'll set you apart from other potential candidates. And it's something too where having good UI UX skills are oftentimes the most noticed thing, even more noticed than like how well you code, because people will first see how something looks. And so for UI UX design, I know we walked through yesterday the setup of this. We're going to be using Figma. So this is what we're going to be actually using to create our designs and to work with prototyping different websites and different apps. Okay, so does everyone have Figma on their computer from yesterday, I hope? Is there anyone that still does not have Figma set up? Okay, are you able to access the GitHub notes?
I just signed into the Slack, so it would be on there.
Yeah. Okay, Colin and Leo will be walking around to make sure we can get Figma set up. What I want to do right now is just to give everyone a brief, like 5 to 10 minute walkthrough of what the Figma interface looks like. Next class, next Tuesday, Amanda's going to be doing a much heavier, like the details and the nitty gritty of Figma walkthrough. But for today, I want to make sure that everyone roughly understands how to use Figma at the most basic level. So if I toggle over to Figma, everyone should see a screen that looks something like this when you first load in. My guess is there's not going to be any like recently viewed projects. But does everyone, when you just first open Figma, see something that looks like this? Can I get a thumbs up if there's something that looks like this? Okay, great. So this is kind of like the start menu of Figma. I'm not going to get too much into the action. Figma started off as a pretty simple platform and has now expanded to have so many different functionalities and different types of boards and other available features. But I'm not going to go over too much of that right now. There's a lot of collaborative features that involve different teams, and basically like being a part of a certain team will let you work on a board with someone else. We're not going to go over that today. What I want everyone to do is to click in the top right, a new design file. And what this is going to do is it should open up to something that looks like this. Does it open up to a light screen though? Or does it a light screen, like a white background? Okay. I'll wait for a minute to where it looks. Can I get a thumbs up if everyone sees this? Wonderful. Okay, so what this is essentially a blank canvas with no screens on it. One of these design files is usually where you'll put all of the designs for different screens of an app or a website into one file. And we can name this file by double clicking at the top, and I'm just going to name this Demo Figma. By default, everything gets saved into your drafts folder. This is what I was mentioning. Think of drafts as kind of like your personal design file folder. This is where things will go default. Some of you may have a white background. Right now, I have a dark background. This can be changed by in the top right corner where it says page. If you click on the little color icon, you can move this slider around and it'll change the actual color of the backdrop. So I just personally prefer a little bit darker, easier on the eyes. But I want to make sure everyone knew that that's where that was if you want to like one-to-one follow along and not get confused at all. Okay, the next part of Figma that I really quickly will go over is the idea of a frame. So a frame is essentially a screen that groups what you're trying to make. And usually you'll create one frame for like one screen of the app. So if you wanted to make like a landing page and then a sign up page, you're gonna make different screens for each of them. And if you click in the top left corner here where it almost looks like a crop icon, but it's not a crop icon, it's a frame icon, or you use the keyboard shortcut F, this will change the right-hand panel and create different options of what frames that you can create. So there's two options for creating a frame. One is you can drag and drop and click to create a frame. So click, hold and drag, and then release. This will create a frame of an arbitrary width or a height. Or if I just delete that by clicking the delete key and I type F again, there's some pre-sized frames that correspond to different sizes of desktop and phone. And so, for example, if I click MacBook Pro 16-inch, it'll pre-populate the correct size of the frame that corresponds to like my screen. So this is a frame. You can rename it by double-clicking in the top left corner where it defaults to the name. And I'm just going to type like a home screen here to call this the home frame. And so as I mentioned, this is where we'll actually put designs for specific features of Figma. Like I said, this is meant to be a very brief overview of the interface as we're going to be demoing some of the more like actual features of Figma a little bit later today. The other thing that I wanted to point out is that, so in this top left-hand side here, this is kind of like the tool area. The most common ones we'll be using are the frame, the shape, the text, and the pen tool. So these are where you find those. And then this right-hand side will change dynamically based on whatever like element on the left-hand side that you're focused on. So if anyone's familiar with Photoshop, the left-hand side is basically like the layer panel where it shows all of the different elements in this file. And so for example, I'll demonstrate really quick if we were to click the rectangle up here and then drag a rectangle into this frame, it'll show the rectangle is part of that frame and kind of the different layers on there. And if we created a new rectangle and gave it a different color, and we're going to go over all this in a little bit. On the left-hand side, if we dragged one on top of the other, that's how you change the layer ordering. So left-hand side shows the different layers in the frame. The right-hand side is completely dynamic based on whatever element you're currently focused on. And next Tuesday, I think Amanda will go into much greater detail about what all of these elements, like what all of these options on the right-hand side actually do. For now, just understand that this right-hand panel is basically a bunch of different attributes that you can change about whatever item you're currently hovering on. Cool. So let's go back to the slides. And like I said, as we introduce some of the design principles, I'll be toggling back and forth between Figma to kind of give an idea of how those are used in Figma. So the first thing that I want to talk about is font. I feel like font is a very basic idea. Like we've all used different fonts to write essays, to create PowerPoints. Designers, if they're trying to be fancy, will call it a typeface. It's the same thing as a font. But the role of font and spacing when it comes to like text on an app, on a web page, is extremely important. A little bit of basic font theory. These are terms you'll hear pretty commonly. There's something called a serif font. So this is a classification of fonts. And what a serif font is it has little like small finishing loops and curves at the edges of every letter. So in the bottom right corner here, this is a serif font, how the T has these little like edges, like these fancy edges. And so this gives a font a little more of an elegant look. Sans serif, sans means without. Very simple, it basically means without this characteristic of a serif font. And so these often look a little bit more minimalist and modern fonts. And the other kind of font that you'll hear about, there's more than just these three, but these are the three most common one, is a monospace font. And all this is that each character takes up the same horizontal width in the typeface. So a lot of like fonts, for example, this font, like this T, is not taking up the same horizontal width as all of the other letters. But these fonts are designed to where each character takes up exactly the same amount of horizontal width. And this is often useful for like OCR image recognition software. Having software that's all the same exact vertical or horizontal width makes it easier for computer programs to detect exactly what letter you're trying to type. I'm sure most people have heard of this too, the idea of a font weight. All a font weight refers to is how thick it is. One thing we'll notice a lot of times is fonts have weights between 100 and 900. This is a standard like naming convention. So the weight is a multiple of 100. And generally, like font designers will have the same names as on the right here, 4 different fonts. Like 100 will be thin, 200 will be extra light, 300 will be light. But a lot of times when we actually get into coding and on the CSS side of things, you'll specify a font weight with the actual number. And so a heavier font has a higher number. The other two important font terminologies are letter spacing and letter height. So letter spacing refers to how far apart individual characters are, whereas letter height refers to how far apart lines of text are. And so what I'm going to do is demo this in Figma really quick. So if we come back over to the Figma frame, I type the T for text tool, I can drag and release to create a little text box. And if I type Hoya devs, then I know it's small right now. We see that since this is the active element, this right-hand panel has given us all of these text options. And a lot of these should be fairly intuitive. So where it says enter, this is just the name of the font. I'm going to switch this over. The font that all of these slides and lectures are in is Poppins. Happens to be a great font, by the way, as Jason back there knows. So Poppins is the font that I'm going to use. Where it says regular here, this is once again the different options for font weight directly beneath the name. So I can go from thin, extra light, all the way down to bold, extra bold. So for now, I'm just going to put it at medium. This number right next to the name or the weight of the font is its size, so I can make this a lot bigger. So we see that. These two right here, the one that says auto, if you hover over it for a second or two, it'll say line height. And this one directly next to it will say letter spacing. And to demonstrate letter spacing, there's two different ways you can do this in Figma. One, you can actually click on the box where it says 0%. And let's say I put it at 20%, these letters become much farther spaced apart. Or in Figma, if you hold over the icon, click and slide the mouse left to right, this will also update the letter spacing. And just to demonstrate the line height, if I select all of this is a common mistake too, so I think a lot of times what'll happen is if my cursor's just right here and I try and adjust this, nothing's happening. That's because I need to select all of the text before I were to adjust any of these properties. So then where it says auto, we're to type 100%, this means like the default line height. We can see that these lines are much closer together. And then if I were to click and drag this out, these lines get much farther spaced apart. So that's the basics of like font terminology. You know, the next thing I want to show, so everyone's familiar with, is Google Fonts. Who here has heard of Google Font before? Who's never heard of Google Fonts? Okay, cool. So Google Fonts is one of the most common ways to actually import fonts when you're building a website. And what this means is that making sure that every device on, like whether you're on a laptop, whether someone is on a phone, depending on what kind of computer you have, each computer has different fonts installed. When it comes to loading a web page, you want to make sure that your website has the same font for everybody. And Google Fonts is the most common way to where your website will actually import a specific font that Google hosts themselves. And this is just a very streamlined way to make sure that everyone, when we actually get to coding, every website will look the same no matter what device has what font or doesn't have a font. And so if you actually go to the link, and this link should be in the class notes from today as well. If you don't have those up, it's just fonts.google.com. What this lets you do is you can search for all different kinds of fonts. There's a bunch of different decorative stroke, as they call it, to where you can select a specific kind of font. So you could select only sans serif fonts. It'll show only sans serif. If we want a monospace font, it'll show that. But what's really nice when it comes to the actual coding portion of this is that let's say we want to make sure our website has pop-ins. I had filters. Pop-ins is not a monospace font, so it didn't show up at first. If I click on pop-ins here, it'll let me download the family if I want to. So if I actually want the actual font file to install on my own computer, it'll provide this here. The other thing that we're gonna make, and it'll also, I forgot to mention, it'll show all of these previews of what the font actually looks like. The other thing that it'll let us do is if we wanna select certain families of this font, for example, when it comes time to actually develop, it'll give us the code that we need to put into our website to make sure, or into our code, to make sure that these fonts are linked properly. And this simplifies a lot when it comes to actually installing and configuring fonts. It does that all for us. The other nice part about this is Figma automatically includes Google Fonts, I believe, when you go to all fonts. And so that's why like pop-ins will already be in Figma to where that's Figma linked to Google Font. Yeah, if you were to click on, if you go to font in Figma and you click on all fonts, you can sort to see like only Google fonts, which sometimes is helpful if you want to make sure the font you're designing with is also a Google font. Not all, there's different licensing stuff around fonts, but this is useful if you want to make sure that your font is free to use, hosted by Google, and can easily be integrated into a website. Any questions so far? I feel like font's a pretty basic thing. Here are some of my fundamental design principles when it comes to fonts. So we talked about the different kinds of fonts, right? Like a sans serif font, a serif font, a monospace font. In any website, you never want to use more than 2 fonts as a general rule of thumb. Oftentimes what I'll do is I pick one font for a site and use a combination of different weightings. The problem, it's okay to use 2 fonts if one's like a serif and one's a sans serif, and you want to use like one style font for a heading and one style of font for like the body text. The problem runs into if you want to use like both sans serif fonts and they're not exactly the same font but they look similar, it oftentimes will cause dissonance in the design and it'll make it just not look as good. So it's always better to try and err on the side of using less fonts and changing the font weights to make things stand out rather than different fonts. The last 2 are just like kind of my general advice from what I found looks best in the past. So when it comes to like a landing page where you have like a tagline or like a big sentence, like text that you want the user to see first, and we'll talk about visual hierarchy in a little bit. Generally, you're going to want to use a little bit condensed letter spacing for those. Generally tends to look better. And then when it comes to body text, right, so like paragraphs in an app, paragraphs on a website, you want to generally set a line height of around 150%. And what this means, 150% for those that are interested, is if your font size is like 24 pixels, this will set your line height to 36 pixels. And so even if the font takes up 24 pixels itself, it'll be 50% more spacing in between each line of text. And this is just a general rule of thumb of like what I think looks good and a good baseline to start with. A lot of times if it's too short, we'll see in a little bit of an example, it doesn't look as good. Let's talk about color. So color is another one of those things where it seems fairly basic and fairly simple, but when I'm looking at a lot of designs, I'll see a lot of mistakes when it comes to color. I wanted to also, I'm not sure if people know this already, but kind of give an idea of how color is actually represented in the website and just in computers in general. So the most common way to represent color is what's called RGB values. These are a series of 3 numbers, 0 to 255. And so all they are is it's amount of red, amount of green, and amount of blue. So the first number corresponds to the amount of red, the second number corresponds to the amount of green, the last number corresponds to the amount of blue. If it's 0, 0, 0, that means it's pure black. 255, 255, 255 means it's pure white. So the more, like in general, if you see bigger numbers, it's going to be a lighter color. This square on the right is the RGB value 134, 45, 210. And who's heard of hex codes before? So hex codes are the same exact principle, except instead of representing the number in base 10, you represent the number in base 16 or hex. And so RGB 134, 45, 210 is the same thing as 86, 2D, D2. And generally, I wrote it here separated to see the conversion, but normally you just write all 6 digits consecutively with a hashtag in front of it. That's a color code. And that's the same way in Figma that colors are shown when it comes to the fill. So they use hex codes. And so, yeah,
Do you have a preference for pure black when designing? I know some designers are really anal about not using.
I personally don't like to use pure black. I'll talk about that in a little bit, but so let's talk about some basic color theory when it comes to actually how to select colors for a website, right? There's a few, so this is one of those things that a lot of times comes down to personal preference for what color schemes to use, how to select colors. But I would say there's 3 most popular ways to do this. How many people have seen a color wheel before like this? So I'm not gonna there's a ton of different shapes and circles that you can make out of the color wheel. That's very, very mathematical. We're not gonna get into this too much, but I'll come back to it in one slide. So the first kind of color scheme that a lot of websites use is monochrome. And all this means is that you pick one primary color. So in this case, for example, blue, and you create different tints and shades of that color. And all a tint and a shade is it's the same proportion of RGB, just more or less. And so what this does is it's using, we can all see that this is the same shade of blue, except some are darker and some are lighter. And this is very popular. It's very easy because all you have to do is basically pick one color and then you run with that. And it can be very simple and very aesthetic. The other side of this, so if we come back to the color wheel, is called complementary colors. And what this is you pick two colors on the opposite ends of the color wheel. So this is why a lot of the times you'll see like blue and orange paired together. You'll see purple and green paired together. Those are like kind of the two most common, and purple and yellow a lot of times too. So complementary colors, just like our logo, it's using two colors on the opposite side of the color wheel. And so what this does is a lot of times you'll use one of these as like the primary color and the second one as an accent color. And this oftentimes will make like action buttons, for example, you'll put in a different color, call to actions in a different color. This adds a little bit more contrast to the app. So if you're worried about it being like super blue, for example, or like all purple, you can add in a complementary color to give it a little bit of an offset. And this is also a very common design pattern. And the last one people are probably familiar with is more of a grayscale color pattern. And what this means, and a very common example of this is Uber. Uber doesn't really use color, if anyone's noticed, for like their, like Uber Eats green, yeah, but like all of the actual design elements in Uber are either dark gray, light gray, white, and they let the color come naturally from any images that are on the site. So like for example, the only color in the image on the left here, there might be a little bit of color in like the cars and then the MasterCard logo. That's the only like non-grayscale color in here. And so they rely on images and logo and icons that have built-in color to them to provide a like visually appealing aesthetic. And so what you'll see is a lot like Apple is a similar way. A lot of these a lot of websites that have a lot of images and icons and logos, they want the actual product to stand out, and so they'll resort to a more neutral color palette to let the content shine. Has anyone heard of the 60-30-10 rule before? I'm curious. Yeah? Okay. So this is a general principle when it comes to, we mentioned how to select color for the website, right? So there's three different like major kind of color theory principles you can follow. You can follow the monochrome, the complementary, or the grayscale. The 60-30-10 rule is adjacent to this, but what this means is that essentially 60% of the color on a screen should be like the main neutral color. And usually this is like a black, a beige, a white, right? Like the base color of the site. Like it's usually not gonna be this vibrant purple, an orange. This is like the default color. So if you're in dark mode, it's like a dark gray. If you're light mode, it's like a light gray usually.
You know the navy blue is that?
Yeah, navy blue can also be. Dark mode, you'll a lot of times see like a dark variation of a monochrome color as like the 60%. 30% will be more of like a primary color. And don't confuse primary color for like red, green, blue. That's not what I mean by primary color. This is like the main color that you're incorporating into your site. And then the 10% should be an accent color. So here, for example, I use like a purple and a lime to illustrate this. But this could also be like a monochrome color scheme, but this could be like a lighter purple or a darker purple. So it doesn't have to be like complementary colors only apply to the 60-30-10. This is just a general idea of like how the visual hierarchy should look. And to give you a better idea to think about, like, you usually want 30% to be like your main color and then a little bit to be an accent color. Just this is a general rule of thumb. And I don't expect anyone to be like measuring pixels or measuring anything like that. It's just like, if you look at something and you notice that there's too much color, it should be pretty apparent. If things look good, it generally follows similar to this. This is another website I wanted to showcase really quickly that I personally use. It's called Coolers. And what this does is if you're trying to like find a color palette that you want to use for a project and you don't know where to start, this just generates like colors that go well together. And what you can do is if you click start the generator, you can select how many colors you want to generate at a time. So like let's say I only want to generate 3 colors. And if I hit space, it'll start randomly generating different colors for me. And then let's say, for example, that I really like this middle blue. I can lock this color, and then it'll only generate colors around it. And so this is a good way for like brainstorming different colors if you see something that you really like. The other thing that this lets you do is you can view the different shades of it. So if you're like, oh, I like this, but a darker version of it, you can change this. I just wanted to show that I think it's a good resource if you're stuck on like what is a good color to use. This is a good place to start. And I use it for a lot of my projects. Yeah? And I guess I'll quickly show in Figma, this should be pretty self-explanatory, but if I click on this rectangle that I had just drawn over here, and I click on the fill icon, this is how you actually change color. You just drag, or you can click into the hex code box and actually put the color in there as well. So I want to do like a random blue, use type 6 digits, and then hit enter. Okay, some general color design principles. This is something I've seen a lot, is when you have like different items on a page, a lot of times people will want to use like a gray and a white to like separate like a box on a website. You don't want to do this. A lot of times the contrast is way too harsh. And in general, unless you're going with a gray, unless you're going with a grayscale color scheme where it's like black, gray, and white, I hate when there's a lot of gray. Like there should be very little gray. If anything, it should be a darker, or a light tint of your primary color. Gray and practically any color look bad together, so generally avoid that. There's different kinds of color schemes besides complementary, where it's like you can do 3 colors and they form a triangle on the triangle wheel, or you can do 4 colors and it forms like a square. I would say generally, it's never going to look bad to follow a monochrome or a complementary color principle, but it's very easy to mess up trying to use more than those colors and make it not look that good. So I would always say try and start with like 1 color, and then if you feel like you really need to add a second color, pick a complementary color to that. But don't have like 8 different colors you're trying to incorporate into a design. And then I think this should be pretty obvious, but you don't want to like make the color behind text match really closely to the text you actually have on display. There's a lot of times what I'll do is I'll put like a really dark shade of the color I'm using and then a really light shade of that same color of the text. That usually looks good, but you want to make sure there's enough contrast there not to have the text get lost in the page. Any questions about color? Okay, let's talk about spacing and alignment. Now this is a fun one. Spacing and alignment is one of the easiest things to do right. I'll take that back. It's not one of the easiest things to do right, but it's one of the easiest ways to improve a design that's poorly done. And why I say that is almost like poor spacing and alignment is one of the most common mistakes I see with designs, where people aren't thinking about like having enough white space in between items. It's not evenly spaced. And so this is a lot of times, if anyone knows that feeling of like, you see a design and you know it looks bad, but you don't know why, a lot of the times it's because of bad spacing and alignment. These are 2 terms I wanted to introduce today, is the idea of margin and padding. These are gonna become like everyday talk when it comes to like the CSS lectures and actually like coding styles. But the general idea is that margin is the amount of space between 2 elements, and padding is the amount of space around an element. So in general, just knowing these 2 terms and a good idea of what these both refer to how much space is in between 2 different elements, but they're different, and they're going to be different when it comes to actually writing CSS code. And the other thing I wanted to make sure everyone understood what I'm talking about is when I say a visual section, it's basically a set of items, so a set of items on a screen that share like the same border or the same background color. It's the same visual hierarchy that they're grouped in naturally onto the page. That's what a visual section is. And I want to make sure everyone knows that because when it comes to text alignment, this is like rule number 1. If you take anything away from today, is this. never, ever, ever make something left aligned and something center aligned within the same visual section. So you either want everything left aligned or everything center aligned. Now generally left aligned is better on desktop layouts. I've done a lot of studies about like how people read a website. Like everyone starts on the left, and in terms of establishing a good visual hierarchy. But it's not uncommon. Like I'll build stuff where like stuff is center aligned or different sections are center aligned, and that's fine. But never ever ever have a section where like something's aligned left and something is aligned center. It looks terrible. And this is what I was saying earlier. If a design looks bad and you can look at something and say, I know this doesn't look great, but I don't know why, the most common reason is there's not enough spacing between the elements, or the spacing is not even. And so I made this earlier. I just want to show as an example. So this, for example, is a quote, a pretend quote. And a lot of people would say like, oh, that doesn't look bad on its own. But the letter spacing is too narrow. And so something like this where you have more even padding. And the other thing, I didn't even do this intentionally, but the spacing is not equal between here. There's more spacing down than up. On this side, I added more padding and then also increased the line height to 150%. And it just naturally looks more visually appealing. And it's even easier to see when these are placed in context to other elements. And so a lot of like these design principles, they may not look horrible if it's just one thing we're looking at, but then if it was surrounded by different things or integrated into the same page, it would look pretty bad. Border radius. Who has heard of a border radius before? Yes, Jason has heard of a border radius. Border radiuses are very much personal preference, but I have a very strong personal preference on border radiuses. A lot of people overdo a border radius and make it so rounded that it actually ends up not looking as good. And so what this describes is how much arch there is on a specific radius on a specific containing element. So this has no border radius, and this is fine. No border radius, everything is very sharp, and it looks very very modern and very just like straight. This has a small border radius, also good. One thing I should mention though is you want to stay consistent over site design, right? Like if you're gonna go with a nice natural border radius for a lot of different elements, you don't want to mix and match. Like you would want to stick with a lot of nice small rounded border radiuses. What you don't want to do is put a huge border radius on all the different elements, because what this does, and the reason I say this is if this is just one element right here, but if all of these were on a grid, and if you can imagine that all of these have the same like super chunky border radius, then there's going to be all this unnecessary white space that groups right here. And so all of these, like, even if they look like this, they may be perfectly spaced. But if you were to add this size border radius, all of the elements are going to look disjunct from each other, and it just doesn't look as good. So big takeaway, small border radius good, no border radius fine, but overly done border radius, it may look fine. Like this doesn't look bad just like that, but if you were to start to place a bunch of these next to each other, they look very bad. Okay, so what I want to do with, perfect, we have 15 minutes. I'm going to send this link to the Slack right now. And so I will show in a second here what this does. Oh, Leo, you already beat me to it. Great. Okay, so this is the first time I've ever done this on Figma, but I should have created a community file that you can more or less clone and like have your own working copy of it. And so the challenge is if I come over here, I've created this card that's like a starting design. This doesn't look terrible. it also doesn't look good in my opinion. I think it looks very mid. And so the challenge is you have 10 minutes starting now to edit this side of it and make it look better. Using everything that we talked about today with all these principles. And then what I want everyone to do is once you've done that, screenshot your computer and then put that into the Slack channel. So I want to see a new design from everybody in the Slack channel.
What channel is it?
It should be Software Engineering Bootcamp. Are you in that channel?
Thanks.
Okay. So yeah, 9 minutes now. Edit the new design, and then once you're confident that the new design looks good, drop it in the Slack channel. Yeah. And what? Leo, can you add Maggie?
I did not make any PowerPoints at all. I was not planning on doing it. Do you think it would be better for? Because I'm mostly just going to be the.
I think for coding, I think for video stuff, PowerPoints are important because like how do you teach Figma with an MP file? You can't. But if it's coding along, then it's like yeah, you're in.
I was thinking about it. If it doesn't work for people, I'll ask people. But I think I'm going to stay to just.
Yeah.
Just got a job offer.
Congrats.
It's Vanguard.
Yeah. Wow. Just sweet or?
It's a
That
full
awesome.
stack. The salary band is okay. It's not.
Congrats, that's
it's
awesome,
not
though.
the.
That's fucking awesome.
I hope it's a job offer. They said I missed you. I have some good news to tell you. So I hope it's not like you did really well, but
We're not hiring right now.
yeah, exactly.
We'd love to tell you that we're hiring,
Ugh,
but the answer is,
been there.
I like the I.
What?
Still no response.
I'm excited to see this.
Just starting with this close enough. I think it make it. Do you have any other sites that you use for financial, like college generation?
There's a really good color college generation site that like takes a picture and then based on the picture gives you like a color palette. So if you have like I was working for a review somewhere and it's like they give me like a Pinterest board and then I just took a picture of the mass Pinterest board, found like the most used colors,
Huh.
Just grab it.
and then just grab the most used colors.
I've used some weave generator sites. You know what I'm talking about?
No.
Search for, I don't remember what they're called. Search for like SVG weave generators.
Oh yeah, no, I know.
You know what I'm talking
Yeah,
about.
yeah. I'd use like some Figma plugins.
No, Figma. I'm sure Figma does that.
Yeah, they have like. All right, 2 minutes, and then I want to see all these in the Slack. All right, I like what I'm seeing. So where's your?
It's good. I'll do it all at once. But, no, I do need this because I want to build something. I should send them a reply of, you know that little metal thing? I'll be biting the metal. I'll be holding Xbox for the 0.5 for the people. But that's fine.
All right, everybody send your design. Yeah, just screenshot and then send it. Well, just your new one. I mean, it doesn't really matter. Okay. No, I think I like what I'm seeing. I think every design that I've seen so far is better than the starting one. And in the last 5 minutes, I'm just gonna show what how I would improve this, just so there's no right or wrong way to do this, just to give kind of a reference for what I would notice looking at this. So the first thing that I noticed is I think that the background is way too dark. I mentioned I don't really like gray backgrounds. So I didn't talk about box shadows today. If I was gonna do a box shadow, I would turn the color all the way to white, and I would add in effects a drop shadow like this. And I would make it a little blurred and then probably bring the shadow in. This is something that if I didn't have access to box shadow, I would have made the background almost white, but the same tint as this green I provided. The next thing I noticed is a pretty obvious one, that these are not aligned right. So I'm gonna align this left aligned with feature. The other thing is that I prefer more general padding on this card in general. So I'd probably make the padding a little bit bigger. This learn more button, I think I would prefer having a white text just because I think it's better contrast with the color that we're given. So I'd probably switch that to white. And then I also don't like the border radius on this. I think it's too big. So I'd probably drop it down to a 3. And then when it comes to the rest, I'm gonna make sure that my learn more button is equally padded on the left and the right of this box. I'm gonna increase the font weight of the title to stand out. Probably to semi-bold, I think looks good. And then I'm gonna select both of these, move them more into the middle of the card. I'm gonna move this. And then the last thing is this space was nowhere to be seen. This was not aligned with anything. And there's a couple of options you could do with this. One thing that I would see doing is potentially I would also make this probably a little bit bigger, just to make sure the visual hierarchy stands out. The other thing that you could do is make sure that this is like evenly spaced with that. And evenly aligned with the font size, so it's kind of evenly spaced there. The other thing you could do is drag this out to over here to where it like aligns all of that. But for now, I'll just keep it there. And then I'm just gonna kind of clean up the remaining border, like the remaining padding, to make sure it looks like it's a good amount. And so I would probably do something like that. That's my and the last thing I'd probably do is I'd probably increase the font weight of the button just to make it stand out a little bit more. Probably something like that. But as I said, there's no right or wrong way to do this. I hope today helped kind of get a general idea of like general design principles, seeing what looks good, what looks bad, why something looks better. Next Tuesday, Amanda's going to be leading the lecture, and she's going to go much more into detail of some more advanced Figma things and teaching how to build like a full web page in Figma, so using the principles we talked about today. Other than that, I think that's it for today. If you have any questions, feel free to stick around, talk to Leo, Colin, or myself. And other than that, thank you, and we'll see you next week.